What if I told you that for $1,500, you could have a large format cinema camera that has a higher bitrate than the RED Monstro and a greater color accuracy than the Sony Venice? It's true. I was on the hunt for the perfect full-frame camera. I wanted something large format so I could take advantage of all of my vintage full-frame lenses. So I wanted something that had pretty decent stills options, but also high enough video quality to be a proper B-cam next to my RED Komodo. The tricky part was I wanted to stay under $2,000, but I didn't want some crappy video codec either. I started thinking that perhaps what I wanted just straight up didn't exist, certainly not for under $2,000. But then I remembered a little tiny camera that was released on the eve of our beloved 2020. And it may just be my favorite camera ever. I absolutely love it, mainly because it is a pure joy to work with. And if your gear is not inspiring you to go outside of your own comfort zone and create more fun stuff, then what the hell's the point anyways? I'm talking about the Sigma FP, the world's smallest and lightest large format cinema camera ever. Now, FP stands for Fortissimo Pianissimo, and in the world of music, Fortissimo means very loud, while Pianissimo means very quiet. They chose the name FP because the camera can be used with the tiniest of setups, but also can be built out for full-blown professional cinematography work. Now, you guys may remember when the FP first came out, all the big camera YouTubers straight up burned it at the stake, and I would like to think that was because the original firmware wasn't all that great. However, they have updated that firmware quite a few times since, and actually it is now up to version 3.01, and Sigma still has future updates in the works. Now, back in its release of October 2019, the FP was dropped for just shy of $2,000, but nowadays you can pick up a brand new FP for only $1,500. Now, because of that insanely low price, most people will want to try to compare the FP to the Blackmagic Design Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. Let me tell you, as a user of both of these cameras, why that is an unfair match where the FP straight up obliterates the Pocket 4K. The first reason should be a no-brainer. The FP is large format. And if you do not realize the advantages of full frame versus micro four thirds, check out this example right here. Our friend Phil Holland makes this really simple thanks to his awesome, helpful website. Now, this comparison is with a 35mm lens on a full frame sensor. So you would have to use an 18mm lens on the Pocket 4K to get a similar field of view. But what's even more important is the depth of field. Now, this is a category where a lot of people like to debate and bicker and argue back and forth online. However, before we look at this, keep in mind that Phil Holland is a reputable industry professional within real Hollywood, okay? So if you want to debate anyone, take it up with him. And I'm roping Phil into this because, again, to show the example of this, I'm going to use another handy tool from Phil Holland's website, the Depth of Field Calculator. So if I take this full-frame 35mm Zeiss Milvus lens and put it on my full-frame Sigma FP camera, and I want to focus my subject from 3 feet away and have my aperture at an f2, my depth of field would be 0.26 feet. But now to match that same depth of field with the Pocket 4K, not only would I need an 18mm lens, but I also would need to be able to open that 18mm all the way up to an f1. And that is just in order to get the similar depth of field that you would get with a 35mm lens set to an f2 on the Sigma FP. I don't know of any full-frame 18mm lens that opens up to an f1, let alone a native micro four thirds 18mm lens. I do plan on doing a video in the future where we're going to compare the Sigma FP up against the Super 35 of the RED Komodo, and then also compare the differences with the speed booster on the Komodo versus the FP. But I think you are all already starting to realize the advantages of full frame over any other sensor, especially something as tiny as micro four thirds. And also, being someone that used speed boosters for a very, very long time, they always come with some complications, even with the highly reputable, expensive Metabones. But beyond it being large format, the Sigma FP can shoot 12-bit 4K RAW. Now that's true RAW, not some highly compressed RAW such as Blackmagic RAW, but real RAW, the original RAW format, Cinema DNG. Let me remind you all about this relic. Cinema DNG is the highest quality, most uncompromised RAW that there is. With almost zero compression, it gives you the most flexibility and allows us to see exactly what the sensor sees. There is no other RAW codec as superior as Cinema DNG. In my opinion, it's as close to shooting on film that we as digital filmmakers can possibly get. It may eat a hell of a lot more storage space, but that's because it's the real deal. To put this into perspective for you, the Sigma FP is writing 12-bit 4K RAW at speeds that are 83% faster than the Pocket 4K when it's at its highest resolution and highest quality of Blackmagic RAW. The Sigma is over 1,300 megabits faster. P4K, you were fun, but you're out. In fact, the little FP has a higher bitrate than all of its mirrorless competition, faster than cameras that are 3 times its price. It's twice as fast as the Lumix S5, 86% faster than the S1H, 33% faster than the Sony a7S III, 10% faster than the Canon R6, and 380 megabits faster than the R5. Not to mention, other than the R5, none of those other cameras can even do internal RAW. Do you see the pattern here? They called the Sigma FP a cinema camera for a reason. If you're still not convinced, let me put it to you this way. The Sigma FP's bitrate is 2,980 megabits per second. That is 580 megabits faster than the RED Monstro. Now you're probably asking yourself right now, why is this ugly dude so caught up on bitrate? That just means more expensive memory space and longer offload times. But there's one important thing that people don't really acknowledge anymore, and that is the higher the bitrate, the higher the quality of video. There was a time when that was a pretty important spec that a lot of people used to base their decision on before they made a purchase. But nowadays, everyone, me included, have gotten wrapped up in being obsessed with smaller file sizes, not realizing the impact that has on our footage. And you know, I'm to blame too. I was all on that B-RAW train when it rolled out. But you know, me and all of my fellow Dog Times Patreon Discorders, we've recently really been lamenting those old Cinema DNG files. Big deal if your camera can do 4K 60p, it's not gonna matter if it's doing that high resolution at a little tiny bitrate, because resolution and bitrate go hand in hand. Everyone in the world complains about YouTube compression, but no one wants to admit to the compression that their camera has. But even if bitrate is something you could still care less about, how important is color accuracy? This is Paul Achtel. He is an accredited member of ACS, the Australian Cinematographers Society. Now, back in 2020, Powell was part of Avatar 2's underwater unit, which was being shot on the Sony Venice. And since Powell is also on the technical committee of the Giant Screen Cinema Association, he was performing color tests on all of the industry's large format cameras. And since Sigma had just released the world's smallest large format cinema camera, he decided to test it against the Sony Venice. It's arguably one of the industry's leading cinema cameras, or at least certainly was at the time, having been used to shoot shows like Downton Abbey, amongst many others. And here he is comparing that to this little tiny mirrorless camera, the FP. So now these tests that Powell performed were called spectral color tests, and they were pretty damn advanced. They go way beyond just pointing the camera at some little rinky-dinky chart in a room. In fact, it doesn't involve putting a lens on the camera at all. Instead, they project a monochromatic light directly onto the sensor. This allows them to see the full range of colors that the camera can actually produce, as well as the color accuracy of that specific sensor. And what he found was that the Sigma FP covers the entire Rec 2020 color space at full saturation, actually delivering better results than the Sony Venice. But here's the thing, once I actually use the little Sigma FP, it's like I don't even care about all those amazing test results, because this little camera is so damn fun to use. But then when you turn around and look on the internet, there's a lot of people complaining about this camera. And a lot of those complaints are actually about the picture profiles, which does seem a little bizarre to me, especially considering what we just learned from Powell's test results. The reason why I say it's bizarre, though, is because all of the picture profiles are totally customizable, down to the amount of sharpening that you desire. And there's even a tone button to quickly control the shadows and highlights. But also, you're burning 12-bit uncompressed RAW. So in post, you can literally strip the data down to its bare bones and create your own wacky color profile. It's a simple color space transform within Resolve. I mean, let's be honest, after hearing Powell's test results, I'm convinced that anyone having any issues with the colors coming out of the little Sigma FP is purely user error. Just like with any tool, you have to learn how to use it, and me, myself, I am certainly not excluded from that. Something I've already discovered in my own testing with the FP is its true latitude. Sigma claims this little camera has over 12 stops of dynamic range, so the FP has two native ISOs, 100 and 3200. And when you're doing stills, you can drop that ISO all the way down to 6. So no need for an ND filter when you're doing photography. And as I've been saying with all RAW formats for a couple years on the channel now, the lower native ISO handles the low light situations much better, while the higher second native ISO fares better with overexposure. As you can see here, when we are 4 stops underexposed, ISO 100 holds the most details in the shadows and has a much cleaner image overall versus ISO 3200. Whereas look how well that second native ISO of 3200 holds the detail much better when we are 4 stops overexposed. Now, that's me literally trying to destroy the footage. That's the whole point of a latitude test. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen an HDR monitor when it's 4 stops over or under, but those images were recovered from this. Not bad for a $1,500 camera. Just a great example of why higher bit rates and cinema DNG matters. Now, the caveat to getting 12-bit 4K RAW is burning to an external SSD. So there's the catch, I guess. However, if you're fine with 12-bit FHD RAW, aka 2K, you can stay nimble and burn to the internal SD card. And as long as it's a V90 card, you can get up to 60 frames per second, 12-bit FHD RAW. I know this may sound crazy, but I'll take the 12-bit FHD Cinema DNG over the 4K of some crappy H.265 file any day of the week. Just because it's higher resolution doesn't always make it better. I'm pretty sure that's been Aries' motto since like day one. Or you could stay minimal and burn 8-bit 4K Cinema DNG internally, but again, you will need a V90 card to keep up with those very high bit rates. And with a 256GB SD card, you can get 20 minutes of 8-bit 4K RAW. However, if Cinema DNG is overkill for you, the FP still offers all i.mov files at 440 megabits per second, at all flavors of resolutions and frame rates, and all to the internal SD card. That means you can do 4K up to 30 frames per second, or FHD up to 120 frames per second, all internally. And keep in mind, those all-I files are twice the speed and quality of what most mirrorless cameras offer. And you do not need a V90 card for those all-I files. And with a 256GB SD card, you can get an hour of 4K or 3 hours of FHD. And keep in mind, no matter what bitrate of RAW or frame rate you choose, you are always utilizing the full frame. There is never a crop in on the sensor. Now, a lot of folks were pretty bummed that the FP doesn't offer 4K 60 frames per second, and I do agree that is a bit of a bummer. In fact, I would have thought that would have been one of the upgrades with the second generation, the FPL. But unfortunately, the FPL still does not offer 4K 60p. The only benefits of the FPL that I can see is that it does have a newer sensor with double the megapixels, but yet still offers all the same resolutions and frame rates for video. But to make it worse, the FPL crops in on the sensor at some of those higher frame rates. So the FPL really seems to be more of an upgrade for our photography users, which does seem kind of odd because they've chosen to call it a cinema camera. Either way, if you ask me, the original Sigma FP is still a bit of a unicorn because full-frame 12-bit 4K Cinema DNG RAW is pretty hard to come by for $1,500, especially when you consider those super fast write speeds and that amazing color science. Not to mention, there's no overheating in this little body. The heat sink on this thing is awesome. It never even gets hot, and it can do continuous recording over 2 hours. The Sigma FP body is completely covered in die-cast aluminum, which keeps the body very light and very easy to dissipate heat. The real gem here is that there is a very large heat sink that is sandwiched in between the back of the LCD screen and the camera body itself. And then the outer surface is covered with heat dissipation coating. Me personally, I just recently spent 3 full days up in the valley, wicked hot 90s heat, out there from 9 a.m. to sundown. This camera was on the whole time. I was shooting at all different frame rates and resolutions, and it never once got hot. On top of that, there's also 42 points of splash and dust-proof seals. I loved what one guy said. He called it the Japanese Leica. Now, regarding ergonomics, the lack of a hand grip was literally only one of 2 complaints that I had with the little FP. However, that was a very affordable, fast, and simple fix with this $26 half-cage grip from NiceRig. But before we get into other mods, because this camera is very modular, hence its name, I want us to talk a bit about the photo options, because this camera has a pretty decent stills mode as well. 24.6 megapixels, 6K 14-bit DNG RAW photos on a full-frame sensor. More than enough for anything going on Instagram. But again, if you need more than that, the FPL can give you 61 megapixels with 8K resolution for stills. Now, when it comes to this camera and what you find online, a lot of people complained about the menu systems, which seemed crazy to me because a lot of those people were Canon and even Sony users. Now, I don't know about you guys, but have you ever once dove into the menus on a Sony camera? It's like the labyrinth. The FP has 9 little short pages, total. But something really smart that Sigma did is when you are in Cine mode, all the menus and functions are catered for Cine use only. And when you switch to stills mode, all the menus and functions change for photography. I absolutely love that. One of the most annoying things when using other mirrorless video cameras is when you're in video mode and you need to change one little setting, you have to scroll through so many unnecessary photo options. Sigma takes out all the fat and keeps the menus separate, the way it should have always been done. Cinematography options for Cine mode, photography options for stills mode. Brilliance. On top of that, you can still snap photos while you are recording. And the coolest part is, your custom quick select menu changes based upon whatever shooting mode you are in as well. So no matter if you are in Cine or stills mode, with the tap of a button, all your favorite tools for either of those shooting modes will pop up instantly. I absolutely love that. And to take it a step further, Sigma included a QR code curator so you can quickly share your settings with other Sigma FP cameras. And as a bonus for all of my fellow FP users out there, I've left a link down in the description below to a QR code with all of my FP settings. It's just a smart design, and it's the little things like that that really make it more enjoyable to use. Some of my other favorite features of this camera are the waveform, time code, grids, the leveler, and the ability to playback RAW in camera and even manage those RAW files in playback. So that's a big deal, being able to delete files off of the card as well as a leveler. Those are a couple options I wish were available on my $6,000 Komodo. Now, what a lot of DPs use this little camera for is a director's viewfinder. That's actually how I came to own this camera. A kind of high-level DP here in LA. He had this camera, was using it as a director's viewfinder with the PL mount and the little wooden camera grip and all of that. He used it once and it sat on the shelf, so I bought it off him. But the director's viewfinder mode is stocked with all of ARRI, REDs, and the Sony Venice, and you can match with any aspect ratio and format from those camera companies. Now, something cool that I found, like a little hack, is that director's viewfinder mode opens you up for the option to record anamorphic with the display screen de-squeezing the image for you. For instance, within director's viewfinder mode, you can switch to, let's say, the Alexa Mini LF and choose any anamorphic flavor of your choice, throw on an anamorphic lens, and simply hit record. It's pretty cool if you want to avoid using an external monitor with anamorphic lenses. Something else pretty unique to this camera is you can create GIFs in camera using the Cinematography mode. There's just all these cool little weird hidden talents that the FP has, down to its locking battery door that has a little slot for dummy battery to detap. Now, speaking of battery, I've mainly just been using the little internal Sigma batteries. I've been able to get anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours, really just depending on how often I'm recording, as well as, it kind of depends on which frame rates and resolution I'm shooting in as well. Now, that 1.5 to 2 hours is not constantly recording, however, that is with the camera constantly on. One thing I noticed when using third-party batteries is sometimes there's a pretty wicked flicker on the LCD screen, or if not that, then there's this weird charging logo that pops up on the screen, which is kind of bizarre because there's not really a way to charge the batteries when the camera is running, not to my knowledge anyways. Because in fact, that's actually one of the benefits of the FPL is you can actually charge the camera via the USB-C. So that whole issue with the off-brand batteries kind of makes me nervous, so I've just been sticking with the Sigma batteries. Now back to the mods. You'll notice that I did add the electronic viewfinder because the LCD screen is fixed. And even though this screen is super bright and contrasty, I tried to use it for a couple days and it will put a little crick in your neck. So in my opinion, if you want to stay as small as possible, the electronic EVF is a must. With a 1/2-inch 3.6 million dot OLED screen, it is simply gorgeous. It tilts 90 degrees, and I just absolutely love that Sigma included this larger eye cup. It just makes the camera even more fun to use. I just can't stop saying that. And take it from me, I have never been a fan of EVFs. I tried the Small HD, I tried the Portkeys Li, I had the Zacuto way back. I just always end up ripping them off. For whatever reason, I love using the FP with this EVF. It's just a killer combo, and I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's because my setup is so tiny and the EVF is just so nice to tilt and move around. I mean, honestly, I can't imagine using this camera without it. Sigma really did streamline everything. There's just a simple button here to click off between the EVF and the LCD, and the really cool part is you can still record to SSD with the EVF attached. Now, if you're wondering where you would mount the SSD while using the EVF, I picked up this small rig cage for $118 for just those occasions. Which, by the way, is the first small rig cage that I have ever seen with an official certification stamp. And now here's a really cool bonus. The EVF actually adds a headphone jack to the camera. So if you notice here, with the EVF attached, you still have access to your microphone port. And then you can control both the mic and headphone levels either through the menus, or you can do like I did and program the gain and headphone level functions directly to the scroll wheel buttons. Again, a QR code to all of my settings is down in the description below. And here's the thing, surprisingly, the preamps in this camera are pretty dang good. Here's a quick sample using just the Hollyland Lark 150 directly into the Sigma FP.
The purpose and the meaning behind the murals, I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory. It says no one should be imprisoned for weed. Depending on what state they're in prison for up to, 20 years to life. And it just seems like such an outdated concept.
I just love it. I love this camera, I love using it, and I absolutely love the images it produces. Now here's another bonus. If you are doing a little studio setup with tripods and stands, or you're trying to build like a real cinema rig out of this, if you have either a Blackmagic Video Assist or an Atomos recorder, there's also the option to record Blackmagic RAW and ProRes RAW. Now, what is really cool about the external recording is that opens you up for 4K DCI, which is true cinema 4K. And something else kind of cool is that Blackmagic Design just released a new firmware update last month, specifically made for improvements when recording Blackmagic RAW from the FP and the FPL. However, I have one important note in regards to external recording with this camera. You will want to make sure that whatever HDMI cable you're using can actually handle those very high bit rates. I got this awesome 8-SYN one that's super nice and thin and still super fast. I'll leave a link down below because I know it's going to come in clutch when I want to throw the FP on my Ronin S2. Speaking of which, another bonus is when you are using the FP with your RS2, you can control the camera through the gimbal. But for 98% of the time, this is how I use this camera. I mean, talk about incognito. When I'm using the FP like this, I feel like how I imagine Bruce Wayne feels when he's walking around Gotham without his batsuit on. No one knows the power that I hold. Because I really do think that the images coming out of the Sigma FP are just so dreamy, and to me it just has a really nice, silky, filmic look to it. This camera is like a little diamond in the rough that gets a lot of hate. But look, people will always hate what they do not understand. And I totally get it. The little FP is not for everybody. If you do not have the patience for real RAW, that's totally understandable. And if you're on the high-res train, I get that too. But it's different tools for different mules. Me personally, I like owning cinema cameras, not video cameras. And that's why I own the Sigma FP. Hashtag not sponsored, just always super passionate about the tools I love using. As always, thanks for watching. I know that was a big one, but I wanted to get the most of it out. You know, I have been using this camera for a few weeks now. I've been shooting a lot of photos with it. I've been doing BTS stuff with it on my gaffer jobs. And I recently just shot something really cool with world famous artist BB Bastidas. So hit that subscribe button if you're new here. Shout out to all of my loyal Dog Times Patreon supporters. Special thanks to the members of the Dog Times Patreon producers tier. That's Mike Skinner and Fred Parr. Thanks to you for watching the video all the way through. I know this was a beefy one. Wait a second. That's a wrap. All right. What takes doing a talking head so long in Glendale, California, is because a plane flies over every 2 minutes. When you go to edit a YouTube video and you live in LA, there's like, you scrub through, there's easily 20 minutes of just fucking plane noises. It's like you get half a sentence in and then you just gotta sit and wait. So yeah, guys, if there's like a weird whistling throughout this video, it's because my neighbor just enjoys blowing leaves in her face for hours on end. Warning, this video is in no way, shape, or form sponsored by anyone. The opinions expressed are solely that of Justin Phillip and Justin Phillips alone, a rebel of his own accord. Viewer discretion is advised.